Hey everybody, Christian here. My previous vlog episode I briefly mentioned incomplete moral knowledge as a relevant consideration of the problem of evil. In this episode I'm going to explore that a bit more and use an interesting thought experiment called Happy Land, in which there is great happiness, no pain, and yet it's a world you probably don't want to live in. Part 1. Skeptical Theism. Skeptical theism comes in a number of varieties, but the general idea is to point to the limits of human cognition when responding to the problem of evil. Arguments from evil critically depend on us not knowing of morally sufficient reasons for why God would allow evil. Because if we did know of such morally sufficient reasons, the argument from evil would hardly be convincing. This raises an important question. If God did have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil we see, would we know what they are? I don't think it's necessarily the case that if God and evil coexisted, we would know why God allows evil. One mistake that theists and non-theists often make is having an overly anthropomorphic view of God, such as making God in one's own image. Among those who have the most anthropomorphic view of God, I think atheists take the cake. Many morally decent atheists would not allow evil, and so they reason God would not either. It's surprisingly easy to forget that if God exists, God's mind is infinite, whereas ours is finite, because the chasm between the infinite mind and the finite human mind is so unfathomably vast, it's easy to underestimate the effect this would have. We cannot reasonably expect to know the why behind everything God does, and perhaps we cannot reasonably expect to understand the why behind most things God does. Due to that chasm between God's infinite mind and the finite human mind, it's plausible that if God and evil were to coexist, we wouldn't be able to comprehend all the reasons why God allows evil, any more than an ant could comprehend why the sun gives off heat. By my lights, our inability to comprehend all the reasons why God allows evil is, if anything, to be expected. Well, how about this objection? If God existed, he would make us intelligent enough to understand those reasons and tell us those reasons. Unless he had morally sufficient reasons not to do that, and you may not be able to think of such reasons, but then we're right back where we started, us not knowing why God allows bad things. And really, if not knowing why God allows evil is the worst thing that's happened to you, consider yourself very lucky. At the end of the day, if God exists, then God's mind is infinitely beyond ours, and it doesn't quite follow that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil only if we had some idea of what they might be. The list of possible relevant cognitive limitations humans have regarding the problem of evil is pretty long, but for this episode I'm only going to focus on one: incomplete moral knowledge. Part 2. Incomplete moral knowledge. In my previous vlog episode I explained why without objective morality there is no problem of evil. To simplify, I'll focus on human evil. Suppose a hypothetical theist believes it is good for God to allow the human race to try to overcome evil in the way that it does, which includes the obstacles and limitations humans face. It is good for us humans to fight against evil, refraining from doing morally wrong actions, advancing medical technology, learning to share food with the hungry, and so forth. The upshot is that if God adopted this standard of moral goodness, God would permit the evil in the world. Though an atheist might think that if God adopted their standard of goodness, God would not permit all the evil we see. So in one standard of moral goodness, God would not allow all the evil in the world. But another moral standard, God would allow all the evil in the world. But with no objective moral standard, there's no objective fact of the matter about which standard of moral goodness God would adopt if he existed, and so there'd be no objective fact of the matter over whether God would allow evil if he existed, in which case the argument from evil would thus collapse under its own weight. It couldn't even get off the ground. Here's one thing I want to point out from that. Notice that, at least with respect to human evil, the difference between the hypothetical theist's moral standard and the atheist's moral standard needn't be that different. They could be almost identical. Humans committing murder, theft, fraud, etc. are still bad, and humans exhibiting kindness, honesty, charity, etc. are all still good. So if the hypothetical theist were correct, that one bit of ignorance about God innocence having different responsibilities from us humans would make a huge difference. I'm pointing this out because human knowledge of moral goods is finite and fallible. Consider human disagreements about what is good and bad right now, and it may well be incomplete. As I pointed out in a previous video, a theist could use this human incompleteness of moral knowledge as at least part of her response when confronted with the problem of evil. We may not be able to think of all the morally sufficient reasons for why God will allow evil, but our finite moral knowledge about what is good and what is bad might not be representative of the full moral picture. Couldn't one argue that if there are unknown good-making properties that justify the evils we know, there are also unknown bad-making properties in the world that balance it out? One could, but for that balancing conclusion to work, we would be assuming that we have a representative sample of the full moral picture, and that assumption is very possibly false if our moral knowledge has that type of incompleteness that I've described. To borrow an analogy from philosopher Perry Hendricks, suppose someone owning a 500-acre strawberry garden wants to know if there are any rotten strawberries in her garden. She checks a 5-acre section of her garden and finds no rotten strawberries, but she has no reason to think the rest of the garden resembles the area she checked. That is, she has no reason to think that the area of the garden she checked is a representative sample of the whole. A skeptical theist could argue that this situation is analogous to our situation of incomplete moral knowledge regarding goods and evils, including finite human ability to find morally sufficient reasons for God to allow evil. That we have insufficient grounds to believe our incomplete moral knowledge regarding the goods and evils is a representative sample of the full moral picture. But if our knowledge of morality is so incomplete, wouldn't that mean we can't know what it is that we're supposed to do? Not necessarily. It is quite conceivable to know what one's moral duties are without having complete moral knowledge. To illustrate, at one point as a small child, my responsibilities were extremely limited, and by and large I knew what I was supposed to do despite my moral knowledge being so incomplete. Beyond my limited responsibilities like obeying my parents, the only moral goods I was aware of was pleasure and the lack of pain. I've since learned that this moral knowledge was incomplete. Pleasure and lack of pain aren't the only goods or even the most important ones. Consider a scenario I'll call Happy Land. Everybody is bedridden and paralyzed as a result of continuously being fed drugs that kill all pain and puts the people into a state of extreme bliss all the time, with unthinking machines operating and maintaining everything. While the drugs leave the people in a mindless stupor and they can't exercise much free will in their condition, the drug-induced euphoria results in a far more pleasurable life than people have in the real world. And with all freedom removed, there are no murders, thefts, or other moral evils that exist in this scenario. There is great drug-induced bliss and zero pain. Now here's an interesting question for this Happy Land thought experiment. Which would you rather have? Happy Land or the real world? I'm not claiming Happy Land is the only logically possible alternative for the real world, but it's something to think about regarding moral goods beyond pleasure and the lack of pain. And if you would choose the real world over Happy Land, then these other goods must be extremely valuable indeed. Because given the two choices, the cost of the real world over Happy Land is very high, and includes not just much less pleasure, but all the evil that humanity endures, like starvation and bloodshed. So it's interesting that these other goods would be worth that very high cost. True, Happy Land has no pain, but it also has no freedom, no art or literature, no heroic triumph rising from struggle, no moral or intellectual growth, no thought, and no love. It lacks many of the things that make human life worth living. The 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill said, "Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their side of the question." At any rate, it does seem to me that the real world is preferable to Happy Land, and if so, that means there are more important things than mere pleasure and the lack of pain, and these important things are worth all the evil that humanity endures. If that's true, the moral knowledge I had as a small child was incomplete. Pleasure and the lack of pain are not the only good things, or even the most important things. Not all of us are small children, but I think this helps to illustrate several important points. One can have an accurate picture of moral goods. Pleasure and lack of pain are good things after all, while also having an incomplete picture. The value of unknown moral goods could be extremely valuable, for example worth all the evil humanity endures, as the Happy Land thought experiment illustrates. Even with incomplete moral knowledge, one can still know how one is supposed to behave. I did as a small child, even if I didn't always do so. If this sort of thing can happen to a small child, it seems conceivable that it can happen to an adult human as well, because human knowledge is incomplete in many areas, mathematics, physics, and so forth. I think it's quite reasonable to expect that human knowledge of goods and evils is no exception to such incompleteness. Perhaps such moral knowledge is not as incomplete as mathematics, but it is plausibly incomplete to at least some degree. If God exists, he is infinitely beyond us, even more so than adults' understanding of moral knowledge is beyond a small child's. So I think we have to be humble here and recognize that it's quite possible we don't have the full picture. In fact, if God exists, we very probably don't. Part 3, Conclusion. The general idea behind skeptical theism is to point the limits of human cognition when responding to the problem of evil. Part of the problem is that it's tempting even for atheists to make God in our own image. For example, assuming that God has the exact same moral standard of goodness we do, having only those moral values that we are aware of. Notably, something called apophatic theology describes God by way of saying what God is not. For example, saying that God is not evil, rather than saying God is good. The idea being that to say that God is good limits God to what good behavior means to human beings. Agree or disagree, That's the idea, and I think that's not entirely without merit, since it should be remembered that if God existed, his mind would be infinitely beyond our own, and so his ways wouldn't necessarily be our ways. We should be very careful about having an overly anthropomorphic view of God. To help illustrate the thinking behind this, I used a Happy Land scenario. In Happy Land, all humans are bedridden and continuously fed drugs to put them into a state of mindless and extreme bliss all the time. Is the real world preferable to Happy Land? If so, then there are goods beyond pleasure and lack of pain, and these goods are worth all the evil that visits humanity, which when think about it is quite remarkable when considering the problem of evil. As a small child, my knowledge of what is good and bad didn't extend far beyond seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. There were many moral goods I didn't know about. The Happy Land scenario helps illustrate that one can have an accurate picture of moral goods while also having an incomplete picture. The value of unknown moral goods could be extremely valuable, for example with all the evil humanity endures, as the Happy Land thought experiment illustrates. Even with incomplete moral knowledge, one can still know how one is supposed to behave. I did as a small child even if I didn't always do so. As we recognize that human knowledge is incomplete in many areas, I think it is quite reasonable to expect that human knowledge of goods and evils is no exception. This especially holds true if my theistic hypothesis is correct, since if God existed, he would be infinitely beyond us. Even more so than adults' understanding of moral knowledge is beyond a small child's. Due to the chasm between the finite and the infinite, we cannot reasonably expect to understand the why behind everything, or perhaps even most things, God does. And I see little reason to believe that the reasons for why God allows evil would be an exception. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.